Chapter 1. Maycomb and the Finch Family. Maycomb was a quiet town, slow and warm, with dusty streets and houses spread far apart. People knew each other's business, and summers seemed endless. In one of these houses lived the Finch family. Atticus Finch, a tall, calm lawyer, raised his 2 children alone after their mother passed away. His son, Jem, was brave and curious, always testing the limits of childhood, while his daughter, Scout, was small, sharp, and full of questions about the world. The Finch house was near the mysterious Radley house. The paint was old, the trees around it tall and dark, and the sense of silence clung to it. Rumors surrounded Boo Radley, the reclusive man who had not been seen for years. Children whispered stories, some frightening, some strange. Jem and Scout often imagined who Boo might be, creating adventures in their minds as they watched the shadowed windows. That summer was quiet, yet full of anticipation, the kind of summer that would slowly teach the Finch children about courage, kindness, and the complexities of human nature. Chapter 2. Scout's First Day of School. The first day of school came quickly. Scout felt nervous as she walked into Miss Caroline's classroom, her little lunchbox clutched in her hands. She had spent the summer reading with Atticus, learning words and stories, so she thought school would be easy. But Miss Caroline, her teacher, didn't seem to understand that. "You can't read like that," Miss Caroline said sharply, and Scout felt a sting of embarrassment. She had always loved learning, and it confused her that her reading was suddenly a problem. At school, Scout noticed the other children. Some were kind and curious, while others were quick to judge anyone who was different. Scout was bright and eager, but she was also headstrong, and she didn't like being told she was wrong when she knew she was right. She quickly learned that the rules of school were not always fair, just like the rules of the town she lived in. That same day, Scout tried to explain Walter Cunningham's situation to Miss Caroline. Walter was a boy from a poor family, and Scout knew he could not afford lunch. When she mentioned it, Miss Caroline became frustrated. Scout realized then that even adults could misunderstand people, no matter how well-meaning they were. Though the day felt confusing and harsh, Scout returned home to Jem and Atticus, where the world made more sense. Atticus was patient and kind, always ready to answer her questions and teach her about fairness, compassion, and understanding. School was only the beginning of her lessons in seeing the world clearly, and Scout didn't know yet how much she would need those lessons in the months to come. Lessons in kindness. The next morning, Scout walked to school with a heavy heart. She still felt upset about how things had gone the day before. Jim tried to cheer her up, but her mind was busy with thoughts she couldn't quite explain. At lunchtime, Scout noticed that Walter Cunningham hadn't brought any food again. When Miss Caroline tried to lend him money, Walter refused politely, just as Scout knew he would. The Cunninghams were proud people. They didn't take what they couldn't pay back. Miss Caroline didn't understand this, but Scout did. It was something Atticus had explained to her, that every family had their own way of living, and you should never look down on someone for it. After school, Scout found herself in a small fight with Walter, frustrated by how unfair everything felt. Jem saw them and quickly stopped her. Instead of scolding her, Jem did something kind. He invited Walter home for lunch. Scout was surprised, but she followed. At the Finch house, Atticus treated Walter like a guest of honor. He spoke to him kindly, asking about his father and the farm, as if Walter were a grown man. Scout watched the way her father showed respect to everyone, no matter who they were. She learned more from that lunch than she ever could in school. But when Scout made a face at the way Walter poured syrup all over his food, Calpurnia, the Finch family's cook, quietly pulled her aside. "Don't you be rude, Miss Scout," she said gently, but firmly. "That boy's company. Don't matter how he eats, it's your job to make him feel welcome." Scout felt ashamed. She realized the kindness wasn't just about being polite. It was about understanding that everyone lived differently, and that didn't make them less deserving of respect. That evening, Scout sat on the porch beside Atticus. The warm wind carried the quiet sounds of the town. Crickets, dogs barking, someone laughing in the distance. Atticus put down his newspaper and looked at her. "You never really understand a person until you climb into their skin and walk around in it." Scout didn't fully understand then, but she would come to remember those words again and again as the town of Maycomb began to show its darker sides.
Chapter 4. The Secrets in the Tree. Spring came to Maycomb, and school days passed slowly for Scout. The lesson still bored her, and she often watched the clock, waiting for the final bell. The only good part about walking home was passing by the big oak tree near the Radley house. One afternoon, Scout noticed something shiny inside a small hole in the tree's trunk. She stopped, curious, and pulled it out. It was a piece of tin foil wrapped around 2 sticks of chewing gum. She looked around, half expecting Boo Radley to jump out of the shadows, but the yard was silent. She sniffed the gum, decided it was safe, and popped it into her mouth. When Jem found out, he was horrified. "You shouldn't eat something from that tree," he said. "It could be poisoned." But when Scout didn't fall sick, even Jem's curiosity began to grow. A few days later, they found another surprise: a small box wrapped carefully with string. Inside were 2 shiny Indian head pennies. Jim said they were lucky. From that day on, both he and Scout started checking the tree every time they passed, as if the old oak had become their secret friend. The summer heat began to rise again, and with it came Dill. Small, talkative, and full of wild ideas as always. The three of them quickly picked up where they'd left off, their favorite subject still being the mysterious Boo Radley. They played games pretending to be him and his family, reenacting all the stories they'd heard. Scout began to feel uneasy about it. Something about pretending to be someone who never came outside felt wrong, but she didn't want to spoil the fun. One afternoon, Atticus caught them playing their Boo Radley game. His voice was calm, but firm. "I hope that game doesn't have anything to do with the Radleys," he said, looking at them with those sharp eyes that seemed to know everything. The children promised to stop, but they didn't fully mean it. They were too curious, too drawn to the mystery. But that night, as Scout lay in bed, listening to the quiet hum of summer insects, she thought about Boo Radley and the strange gifts in the tree. Somehow, she didn't feel afraid of him anymore. She began to wonder if Boo was really the monster people said he was, or if he was just lonely.
Chapter 5 Miss Maudie's Wisdom. As the long summer days went on, Scout found herself spending more time with Miss Maudie Atkinson. Miss Maudie was their neighbor, a cheerful woman who loved her garden and baked the best cakes in Maycomb. She treated Scout like a little friend rather than a child, and that made Scout feel safe and seen. Miss Maudie's yard was always full of life. Buzzing bees, blooming flowers, and the warm scent of earth and sugar. Scout often sat on her porch steps, swinging her legs while Miss Maudie tended her azaleas. They talked about everything: people, the town, and sometimes even Boo Radley. "People act like Boo's some kind of monster," Miss Maudie said one quiet afternoon. "But he's not. He's just a person who wants to be left alone. Some folks can't handle the meanness of the world, so they stay inside it." Scout listened closely. It was the first time anyone had spoken about Boo with kindness instead of fear. Miss Maudie told her that Boo's real name was Arthur Radley, and when he was young, he had made mistakes, but his father had kept him hidden away for years. "It's a sad thing, Scout," she said softly, "to lock someone away from sunlight."
Chapter 6 A Night of Fear and Discovery. The last night of summer came soft and quiet. The air was thick and warm, the kind that made the crickets sing louder and the stars look sleepy in the sky. Dill was leaving for home the next morning, and the children wanted one last adventure, something daring, something they'd never forget. Dill's eyes sparkled with mischief as he whispered his idea. "Let's go see Boo Radley. Just once. Let's look through the window and see if he's real." Scout's heart started to beat faster. She didn't want to go, but Jem was already pulling on his shoes. She followed, half from curiosity, half because she couldn't let her brother face danger alone. The three of them crept across the yard, their shadows long under the moonlight. The Radley house stood ahead, still and dark, its windows like closed eyes. Every sound, a dog barking, a leaf falling, felt too loud. Scout's hands trembled as she clutched Jem's sleeve. They reached the side of the house, and Jem quietly stood on tiptoe to peek through a loose shutter. Scout and Dill waited, holding their breath. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the window, slow and human. Jem gasped, and in an instant, all three of them were running. Scout's heartbeat thudded in her ears. The world blurred. Fences, trees, the smell of dust. Behind them came the sharp sound of a shotgun blast. Someone had seen them. They darted under a fence to escape, but Jem's pants caught on the wire. "Go on!" he shouted. Scout and Dill ran until they reached the safety of the Finch house. Moments later, Jem stumbled in, breathless and shaken, without his pants. Later that night, when the adults gathered on the street, they learned what had happened. Mr. Nathan Radley, Boo's brother, had fired his gun into the air, thinking a prowler had been sneaking around his property. No one suspected the children. But Jem couldn't rest. He couldn't stop thinking about his pants left behind, tangled on the Bradley's fence. Sometime after midnight, he quietly slipped out of the house to get them. Scout waited at the window, her stomach tight with worry. When Jem finally returned, his face was pale, his eyes wide. He didn't say much, only that his pants were folded neatly over the fence and the tear in them had been sewn up by someone who knew he was coming back. Scout didn't know what to make of it. She only knew one thing. The world felt a little more mysterious, and Boo Radley didn't seem like the monster everyone said he was.
Chapter 7. The Hidden Gifts. Summer faded into fall, and Maycomb grew cooler. The air felt softer, the trees began to turn gold, and school started again. Scout dreaded it, but Jem seemed quieter than before, more thoughtful, as if that strange night at the Radley place had changed something inside him. One afternoon, on their way home, Jem stopped suddenly by the oak tree near the Radley house. "Look!" he whispered. Inside the same hole where they had once found gum and pennies, there was something new. 2 carved figures made of soak. One looked like a small boy with messy hair, the other like a girl with bangs and a simple dress. Scout stared at them. "That's us," she said softly. Jem nodded. They didn't know who could have made them, but deep down they both had a feeling. In the days that followed, more treasures appeared in the tree. A broken watch, a spelling bee medal, and once a whole pack of chewing gum. Each discovery made Scout and Jem feel special, as if someone was silently reaching out to them, someone kind and gentle who knew them well. Then, one cold afternoon, when they ran to the tree again, the hole was filled with gray cement. Scout blinked in confusion. Who would do that? Nathan Radley was standing nearby, holding a bucket. "Tree's dying," he said simply. "Had to fill it up." That night, Jem asked Atticus if the tree was really dying. Atticus looked at it from the porch and said, "No, Jem, that tree looks perfectly healthy to Mitty." Jem stood quietly for a long time after that. He didn't say much the rest of the evening. Scout noticed his eyes looked sad, like he had just lost something he couldn't explain. Later, when she woke in the middle of the night, she saw Jem sitting by the window, deep in thought. She didn't ask what he was thinking about, because she already knew. The gifts had stopped. The secret friend who had been watching over them, likely Boo Radley, had been silenced again.
and somehow the world felt a little colder.
Winter came to Maycomb for the first time in years. The air grew sharp and quiet, and one morning Scout woke up to see the world covered in white. Snow, real snow, lay across the yard like a blanket of soft sugar. She had never seen it before. "Jem, look!" she cried, running outside in her pajamas. Jem came running too, just as excited. They tried to scoop snow into their hands, laughing as their fingers went numb. The neighbors came out to see it too, smiling like children again. That day, school was canceled, and Jem and Scout spent the morning building a snowman. They didn't have enough snow, so Jem mixed it with dirt to make it hold together. It turned out looking more like a mud man than a snowman, but they were proud of it anyway. Jem gave it a carrot nose and Miss Maudie's old hat, giggling the whole time. When Atticus came home, he chuckled softly. "I see you've created quite the character," he said. "Maybe you should make it a little less like Mr. Avery." Jem and Scout quickly changed its face, just to be polite. That night, the temperature dropped even lower. The house was quiet, and Scout slept soundly until Atticus shook her awake. "Come on, Scout, Jem, get up, quick!" Outside, the air smelled of smoke. Miss Maudie's house was on fire. Flames climbed high into the night sky, painting everything gold and red. The whole neighborhood had gathered, helping to carry out furniture and blankets. Atticus told Jem and Scout to stand by the Badley house and stay out of the way. Scout shivered as the cold bit through her pajamas. Jem wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, but she was too focused on the fire to notice where it came from. By the time the sun began to rise, the fire was out and Miss Maudie's house was gone. But she smiled bravely and said, "Don't you worry. I've always wanted the smaller house anyway." Later that morning, Atticus looked at Scout with a strange expression. He said, "Where did you get that blanket?" Scout frowned. "What blanket?" "The one around your shoulders," Atticus said softly. "You didn't notice, did you? Boo Radley must have slipped it on you while you were watching the fire." Scout froze. Boo Radley, the quiet man who never came out, the one everyone feared, had stepped outside in the middle of the night just to keep her warm. She turned toward the Radley house, its windows dark and still. For the first time, she didn't feel scared. She felt grateful. The winter days passed, and Christmas came quietly to Maycomb. Scout could feel that something in town was changing, a tension, a whisper that followed her father's name. It started when one of her classmates called Atticus a nigger lover. Scout didn't fully understand the words, but she knew they were meant to be cruel. Her fists itched to fight, but Atticus's voice echoed in her mind. "You might have to fight with your head for a change." That night, she asked Atticus what it meant. He sighed softly, took off his glasses, and looked at her with tired but gentle eyes. "Scout," he said, "I'm defending a Negro man named Tom Robinson. Some people don't like that, but it's the right thing to do. You'll hear ugly talk about it. Hold your head high and don't let anyone make you mad. Try fighting with your words, not your fists." Scout nodded, but deep inside, she didn't like how people treated Atticus differently, as if doing the right thing was something to be ashamed of. When Christmas arrived, the Finch family went to Finch's Landing, their old family home in the countryside. It was peaceful there, except for one thing: Aunt Alexandra. She was strict, proud, and always tried to make Scout behave like a lady.
She said Scout should wear dresses, not overalls, and stop running around like a wild boy. The Scout tried to stay calm, but her cousin Francis made it harder. He teased her, saying, "Grandma says your daddy's ruining the family by defending that man." That did it. Scout's anger burst out like fire. She jumped on Francis and punched him square in the face. Later, Uncle Jack scolded her, not knowing why she had done it. Scout felt misunderstood and hurt. That night, when Uncle Jack talked to Atticus, Scout listened quietly from the stairs. Atticus's voice was calm. "She's going to have to learn, Jack. This case will bring a lot of ugly things out, people. I just hope I can help her and Jem get through it without losing faith in humanity." Scout didn't understand everything her father said, but she understood his tone. Kind, steady, brave. She realized that Atticus wasn't just fighting for one man in court. He was fighting for something much bigger, something invisible but important, like fairness and respect. And though she didn't say it out loud, Scout decided that night that she would stand by him, no matter what the town said.
Winter stretched on, quiet and gray. Scout and Jam were grown fast, and both of them had started to think their father was, well, a little old. Atticus didn't play football, didn't hunt, and didn't climb trees like the other fathers in Macomb. He just read books, went to work, and spoke softly about justice and kindness. To Scout and Jem, he seemed gentle, maybe too gentle. Then one February morning, everything changed. Scout and Jem were outside when they noticed something strange down the street. Old Tim Johnson, the dog that everyone knew, was walking crookedly, his head low, his steps slow and shaky. At first, they thought it was just sick, but soon Calpurnia, their housekeeper, rushed them inside. She locked the door and called the sheriff. Tim Johnson had rabies. Macomb's quiet streets suddenly turned tense. Doors shut, windows closed. The town went still as Sheriff Heck Tate arrived with a rifle. Atticus came with him. Jem and Scout peeked through the shutters, hearts thumping. Sheriff Tate raised the gun, then hesitated. "Can't shoot him straight, Atticus. You'll have to do it." Scout blinked. Atticus? Their father? The man who read law books and wore glasses? But Atticus just stood there, calm as always. He took the gun, pushed up his glasses, and aimed. The sound cracked the air, one clean shot. Tim Johnson fell, still and silent. Scout and Jem stared in disbelief. Atticus, their quiet, gentle father, had done it in one shot. Not a second one, not a miss, just calm, perfect aim. They soon learned the truth. Years ago, Atticus Finch had been the best marksman in Macomb County. People used to call him One-Shot Finch. He'd stopped hunting because he believed it was unfair, that he shouldn't take life just because he could. That evening, Jem was quiet, thinking deeply. Scout wanted to tell everyone about Atticus's skill, but Jem stopped her. "No," he said softly. "If Atticus wanted people to know, he'd have told them. It's something to be proud of, but not to brag about." Scout didn't fully understand, but she saw something new that day. Atticus wasn't just brave in the courtroom, he was brave in silence, in patience, and in kindness. That night, As the cold wind brushed against their windows, Scout thought about her father's steady hands and calm voice. He didn't fight for attention. He fought for what was right. And in her heart, she began to see him differently. Not as old or dull, but as quietly powerful. Spring began to warm Maycomb, but the days felt a little heavier. Jem was growing older now, quieter, taller, and sometimes moody. Scout didn't always understand him anymore. The easy laughter they once shared was now mixed with sighs and silence. One afternoon, as they walked to town, they passed the house of Mrs. DeBose, an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down. She sat on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, with her sharp eyes watching every step they took. Her voice, thin but strong, carried across the street. "Your father's no better than the trash he works for," she yelled. Jem froze. Scout's stomach dropped. They had heard people whisper ugly things about Atticus before, but never so directly. Jem clenched his fists. Scout tugged his sleeve, whispering, "Come on, don't." But anger burned in his eyes. He said nothing, not yet. Later that day, the anger overflowed. Jem grabbed Scout's new baton and stormed back to Mrs. DeBose's yard. He tore up her camellia bushes, those white and red flowers she loved most. When he was done, he stood breathing hard, his hands shaking. That evening, Atticus came home and listened quietly. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Son, I understand why you're angry, but I won't have you destroying a person's flowers just because they insulted me." As punishment, Jem had to go to Mrs. DeBose's house every afternoon and read to her. Scout went with him, though she didn't want to. The old lady's home smelled of medicine and age. Her hands trembled, her face pale, but her eyes stayed fierce. Jem read from his book as she sat, sometimes listening, sometimes drifting away. The clock on the mantel ticked slowly, every minute feeling like an hour. Days passed. Each visit lasted longer. Sometimes Mrs. DeBose would groan and shake, and the children didn't understand why. When she passed away a month later, Atticus sat Jem and Scout down. "She had her own battles," he said softly. "Mrs. DeBose was very sick. She was addicted to a kind of medicine that made her life easier. But she didn't want to die dependent on it. So she made herself stop, even though it caused her great pain. That's why she had you read to her, to distract her from the pain. She wanted to leave this world free." Jem listened in silence. Atticus put a hand on his shoulder. "I wanted you to see what real courage is. It's not a man with a gun in his hand. It's knowing you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway, and see it through no matter what." Jem didn't say a word, but that night, as he looked at the white camellia Mrs. DeBose had left him, a single perfect bloom, he finally understood what Atticus meant. Real courage wasn't about anger or strength. It was quiet. It was painful. It was choosing to do what's right, even when no one would ever thank you for it.
The seasons changed again, and with them, Jem changed too. He was 12 now, taller, moodier, and full of quiet thoughts Scout couldn't quite reach. Sometimes he told her to stop following him around, to start acting like a girl. Scout didn't like that. They had always been a team. But now she felt like she was losing her brother to some invisible wall called growing up. Atticus had to leave for a few weeks on business. That meant the Finch house felt emptier, quieter. But Calpurnia, as always, kept things steady. She woke them up, made breakfast, and reminded them to behave, though Scout noticed something new about her. A sort of mystery, like there were parts of her life the children didn't know. One Sunday, when Atticus was away, Calpurnia dressed Jem and Scout neatly and said, "You're coming with me to church today." Scout blinked. "Your church?" "That's right," Calpurnia smiled. "My church." It was the First Purchase African M.E. Church, a small, weathered building at the edge of town. The sign out front was faded, and the walls looked old, but the air was warm with life and kindness. As they entered, a few people looked surprised to see white children in a black church. One woman frowned, asking Calpurnia why she brought them. Calpurnia's voice stayed steady, proud. "They're my company." That was all it took. The woman said nothing more. Inside, the service began. There was no piano, no hymn books. Most people couldn't read. But when the singing started, it filled the whole room. The voices rose together, deep and beautiful, like a river of sound that carried everyone with it. Scout had never heard anything so moving. When Reverend Sykes began his sermon, he spoke about Tom Robinson, the man Atticus was defending. He explained that Tom's wife, Helen, was struggling to find work because people were afraid to hire her. Then he asked the congregation to help. One by one, people stood and dropped their coins, their small bills, everything they could spare, into a battered collection plate. Scout watched quietly. She realized that even though these people had very little, they gave what they could for someone in need. It made her feel small and humble. After church, as they walked home, Scout asked, "Cal, how come you talk different at church than you do here?" Calpurnia smiled a little. "It's the same me, honey. But folks don't like it if I talk like white folks when I'm with them. And they don't like it if I talk like them when I'm with white folks. So I do what's best to fit in both places." Scout thought about that for a long time. She realized how little she really knew about Calpurnia, her family, her world, her strength. That night, Scout told Jem she wanted to visit Calpurnia's home someday. Jem nodded sleepily, his voice changing again, deeper now. "Yeah, maybe." As Scout drifted off to sleep, she thought about the songs at church, the warm hands, the laughter, and Calpurnia's calm strength. For the first time, Scout understood that Maycomb wasn't just one world. It was many, overlapping, each with its own story. Summer was fading, and life at the Finch house had begun to feel different. One morning, a carriage rumbled down the dusty road, and standing on the porch was Aunt Alexandra. She was Atticus's sister, tall and proud, with sharp eyes that seemed to measure everything and everyone. "Good morning," she said crisply. Scout felt a shiver. Aunt Alexandra had a way of speaking that made you feel like you were always being judged. Aunt Alexandra decided she would stay with the Finch family for a while. She said it was time Scout and Jem learned how to behave like proper finches. That meant dresses for Scout, polite manners, and no more running around with Dill. Scout tried to smile and be pleasant, but she felt trapped. Her brother Jem was sulking, and even Atticus seemed quieter than usual, like he was trying not to upset her aunt. Over the first few days, Alexandra made her opinions very clear. She spoke about family pride, about the Finch's place in make-home society, and about how important it was to fit in. Scout listened politely, though her heart ached at the thought of losing her free, adventurous life. One afternoon, Scout asked Atticus why Aunt Alexandra cared so much about these things. Atticus looked up from his book and spoke softly. "Scout," said Atticus, "your aunt thinks she's helping, but she doesn't understand everything. But what matters is that we teach you and Jem to think for yourselves, to do what's right, not just what's expected." Scout realized then that life was changing. The carefree summers of playing in the yard, running after Dill, and sneaking near the Radley house felt farther away. But she also felt a quiet strength in her father, a calm that told her she could face whatever came next. That night, as the wind rustled through the trees and the moon cast soft shadows on the porch, Scout lay awake thinking. Aunt Alexandra wanted the Finches to fit into Maycomb's rules, but Atticus had shown her, and Jem too, that real courage and real goodness were measured differently, by fairness, kindness, and quiet strength, not by how well you fit in. And somehow Scout felt ready.
Spring had arrived again, and with it came a sense of change in the Finch household. Jem was growing taller, stronger, and quieter. Scout noticed it most in the way he walked, with a kind of thoughtful pause that made her feel both proud and left behind. One evening, Dill arrived unexpectedly. He had run away from home, tired of feeling unwanted. Scout and Jem were shocked to see him, but Atticus listened quietly as Dill explained why he had come. The boy's voice trembled with fear and hope, and Scout realized how fragile childhood could be, full of longing, misunderstandings, and bravery. Atticus, always calm, told Dill he could stay for a while, but gently reminded him that he needed to speak honestly and follow the rules of the house. Dill promised, and Scout and Jem felt a quiet relief, like a missing piece had been returned. As the days passed, Jem and Scout began to notice the subtle ways the town had changed. Whispers about Atticus's case with Tom Robinson were louder now, though not everyone spoke openly. Scout sometimes heard rude comments at school, and Jem often frowned after walking home. They were beginning to understand that the world wasn't always fair, and that adults could be cruel even when they were supposed to be wise. One evening, Scout asked Atticus why people hated Tom Robinson just because he was black. Atticus took a deep breath and spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Scout, some people are afraid of change. They fear what they don't understand, and so they try to make life easier for themselves by being cruel to others. That's why we have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." Scout nodded, though she didn't fully understand yet. She only knew that life was growing more complicated, that the small town of Maycomb held both beauty and cruelty, laughter and fear, kindness and prejudice. That night, as she lay in bed, Scout felt a quiet strength within herself. She thought of Atticus, of Jem, of Dill, and even of the mysterious Boo Radley. Each of them had their own courage, their own ways of facing the world. Scout knew that she would need her own courage too, and that the lessons of childhood, though sometimes painful, were preparing her for the days to come. It was late summer, and the air in Maycomb was heavy and still. News about Tom Robinson's trial spread through the town, carrying whispers of anger and fear. Jem, Scout, and Dill could feel the tension, even though they didn't understand everything yet. One evening, Atticus left the house quietly. Scout and Jem followed him to the courthouse, curiosity burning in their chests. They didn't know what he was going to do, only that something important was happening. When they arrived, they saw a small group of men gathered around Tom Robinson's cell. The crowd looked angry, tense, and dangerous. Jem's hand trembled as he held Scout's, and Dill clutched Scout's arm tightly. Atticus stood calmly in front of the men, his face quiet but firm. "I'm protecting him," he said softly, almost to himself. The children watched in awe. Their father wasn't yelling, wasn't threatening. He just stood there, steady as a rock. The men's voices grew louder. They demanded that Tom be handed over, but Atticus didn't move. Scout, sensing the danger, suddenly stepped forward. She recognized one of the men, Mr. Cunningham, a man she knew from the schoolyard. Scout spoke softly, with all the courage she could summon. She reminded Mr. Cunningham of his own son, of his family, and of the good in him. Her words were small, quiet, but they cut through the anger. One by one, the men's expressions softened, and they began to drift away. Jem and Scout held their breath until the last figure disappeared into the night. Atticus finally relaxed a little, though his face remained calm, tired. The children had witnessed bravery that wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, thoughtful, and steady. On the walk home, Scout felt something change inside her. Fear hadn't disappeared, but she understood now what courage could look like. It wasn't about strength or yelling. It was about standing for what's right, even when everyone else might be wrong. That night, the stars seemed brighter over Maycomb, as if the world itself had noticed the quiet victory. Scout went to bed feeling safe, warned by the knowledge that sometimes even the smallest voices could make a difference.
The long-awaited day of the trial had arrived. The streets of Maycomb were quiet in the early morning, but by mid-morning, the courthouse filled with townspeople. Scout, Jem, and Dill went with Atticus, feeling nervous and curious. The building was old, wooden floors creaking underfoot, the air thick with dust and anticipation. People whispered as they found their seats. Some stared at the children, some at Atticus, some at Tom Robinson, who sat quietly in the front row. Scout noticed the tension in the air. It was heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Judge Taylor called the court to order, and the trial began. Atticus spoke first, calm and steady, explaining the importance of truth and fairness. His voice was soft, but it carried across the room, reaching everyone who listened. Scout noticed how people leaned forward, some with doubt, some with grudging respect. Mayella Ewell, the woman at the center of the case, testified next. Her voice trembled as she told her story, and the courtroom was silent, hanging on every word. Then Bob Ewell, her father, spoke, his anger sharp and loud. Atticus questioned them carefully, pointing out inconsistencies and showing the truth without cruelty. Scout, Jem, and Dill watched closely. It was the first time they really understood that the world was not always fair, that people could lie, judge, and condemn even when the truth was clear.
Yet through it all, Atticus remained calm. He never shouted. He never lost his temper. His courage was quiet, and that made it even more powerful. Outside the courtroom, the town seemed tense, restless, full of opinions and fear. Scout felt the weight of it all, and for the first time she realized that standing for what's right could be lonely and exhausting. That night, when they returned home, Scout lay in bed thinking about the day. She thought about Atticus's calm face, Tom Robinson's quiet dignity, and the eyes of the townspeople, some suspicious, some kind, some hard with judgment. Scout didn't know how the trial would end, but she knew one thing. She was beginning to understand the true meaning of courage, justice, and compassion.
The courtroom was tense, full of quiet murmurs and the rustle of papers. Scout, Jem, and Dill sat close to the front, trying to understand the adults' world. Each witness that day revealed more of the town's complexities, the truths, the lies, and the quiet prejudices hidden beneath polite manners. The first witness was Sheriff Heck Tate. He spoke calmly about what he saw on the night of Myella Ewell's alleged attack. He told the court where he found Myella, what she said, and how Tom Robinson came into the picture. Atticus questioned him gently, pointing out details that made Scout and Jem think carefully. Next, Bob Ewell took the stand. His voice was rough, filled with anger and pride. He insisted that he had seen nothing wrong, yet his story had holes, things that didn't make sense. Atticus asked simple questions, letting the truth quietly emerge without yelling or insulting anyone. Scout noticed how carefully he treated each witness, even the ones who were clearly dishonest. Outside the courtroom, Scout could feel the energy of the town seeping through the windows. People whispered, pointed, and stared. Some were quietly sympathetic, others openly judgmental. Scout began to understand how dangerous rumors and fear could be, how quickly a town could turn against someone who was different or vulnerable. During a brief recess, Jem leaned close to Scout and whispered, "It's not just what they say, Scout. It's how they see things. Some folks can't see past color." Scout shivered at the thought, realizing that the world was bigger and harsher than her small childhood adventures. The rest of the day passed slowly, the sun casting long shadows across the courthouse floor. When they returned home, Scout lay in bed, her mind full of the day's events. She thought about Atticus, calm and unshakable, and wondered how he could stay so steady while the world around him seemed so unfair. That night, Scout began to understand something crucial. Truth and justice were not always the same thing, and standing for what's right often meant facing discomfort, anger, and fear.
The courtroom was quiet as Myella Ewell took the stand. She was young and small, and her hands trembled as she sat down. Scout, Jem, and Dill watched closely, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. Myella's voice was soft and nervous as she told her story about what had happened that fateful day. She described how she had been alone in the yard and how Tom Robinson had allegedly attacked her. But Scout noticed something in her words, a sadness, a fear, and a hint that the truth might be more complicated than the story she told. Atticus asked his questions carefully. He was gentle but firm, guiding her with patience, helping her to see what really happened without forcing her to admit it outright. He asked about her chores, about the bruises on her face,
and about her father. Slowly, it became clear that Mayella was lonely, scared, and trapped in a life that left her little choice. Scout noticed Jem's face as the testimony went on. Jem frowned deeply, his lips pressed tight. He could sense, even at his young age, the unfairness of it all. Dill shifted in his seat, restless, unable to understand why people could hurt each other and lie so easily. The courtroom was tense. Every word, every pause, carried weight. Atticus didn't shout, didn't accuse. He simply let the truth emerge in its own quiet way. The children felt a deep sadness, realizing that life could be cruel to those who were vulnerable, whether because of race, poverty, or loneliness. After the testimony, Scout thought about Mayella's loneliness and fear. She remembered Boo Radley and the gifts in the tree, how someone kind and quiet could exist even in a world full of misunderstandings. Scout understood that not everyone had the chance to show their goodness openly. That night, Scout lay in bed thinking about courage, about honesty, and about the many ways people could be trapped by life. She didn't yet understand the trial's full outcome, but she felt certain that Atticus was teaching her, Jem, and even Dill lessons that would stay with them forever. Lessons about empathy, fairness, and seeing the world through someone else's eyes.
The courtroom was quiet again as Tom Robinson took the stand. Scout, Jem, and Dill leaned forward, hearts beating fast, curious to hear his side. Tom's hands were rough from work, and his voice was soft but steady. He spoke with honesty and calm, and there was a gentle dignity about him that made Scout feel both awe and sadness. He told the story plainly. On the day Mayella had claimed she was attacked, he had only gone to help her with chores. She had asked him to come inside the house and fix something, and he had done as she requested. Tom spoke of her loneliness, of the difficulty of her life, and of the fear that seemed to follow her every day. Atticus questioned him carefully, quietly showing the truth without shaming anyone. He asked why Tom had gone to the Ewell house, what happened during the encounter, and about his relationship with Mayella. Tom spoke honestly, never raising his voice, never showing anger, even when the questions were sharp. Scout noticed Jem's face, pale, tense, eyes full of worry. Jem could sense the injustice in the room, even if he didn't yet understand how deeply it ran. Dill fidgeted beside Scout, upset by the way the grown-ups whispered and stared, as if Tom's very presence made them uncomfortable. Tom said something that stuck with Scout long after the trial. "I felt sorry for her," he said quietly. "I couldn't hurt her." It was simple, yet full of courage. In that moment, Scout realized that bravery wasn't just standing up with a gun or shouting. It could be staying calm, telling the truth, and protecting someone, even when it meant risking everything. When Tom left the stand, the courtroom murmured. Some people were angry, some sympathetic, but all had seen the quiet dignity he carried. Scout understood that day that courage and empathy and justice weren't always loud or celebrated. Sometimes they lived quietly in the small acts of honesty and kindness.
The courtroom was silent as Atticus Finch stood to give his closing argument. Scout, Jem, and Dill watched with wide eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. Atticus's voice was soft but firm, carrying slowly across the room, reaching every corner. He spoke about justice, about fairness, and about seeing the world through someone else's eyes. He reminded the jury that the case wasn't just about Tom Robinson or Mayella Ewell, but about doing what was right, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. But there is one way in this country in which all men are created equal, Atticus said. That is in the courtroom, where every man should get a fair trial, no matter his skin color. Scout noticed how the adults in the room shifted, some nodding, some frowning, some quiet. Atticus spoke calmly, never yelling, never showing anger. He used simple words that carried enormous weight. He asked the jury to look past fear, prejudice, and gossip, and to do their duty, to protect the innocent. He also reminded the children, in his own way, about courage and empathy. He said, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." Scout and Jem listened carefully, feeling a quiet warmth in their hearts. Even if the world was unfair, their father showed them the right way to live, with honesty, kindness, and courage. When Atticus finished, the courtroom stayed still for a long moment. The weight of his words hung in the air, like a soft, invisible presence. Scout felt proud, but also heavy-hearted, knowing the town's prejudice might still overshadow justice. That night, Scout lay in bed thinking about her father's voice, steady and calm. She thought about Tom Robinson, about Boo Radley, and about the small ways people could show courage every day. In the quiet of her room, she understood that some battles were fought with words, truth, and integrity, and that sometimes simply standing for what is right was the bravest thing anyone could do.
The courtroom felt heavier than usual that morning. Scout, Jem, and Dill sat quietly, holding hands, their hearts beating fast. Everyone waited for the jury to return, and the silence seemed to stretch forever. The jury filed in slowly, each step echoing across the wooden floor. Scout could feel Jem's grip tighten on her hand. When the foreman spoke, saying the word guilty, Scout felt the world tilt. Her stomach dropped, and Jem's face went pale. Dill buried his face in Scout's shoulder, trembling. Atticus's expression stayed calm, though Scout noticed a flicker of sadness in his eyes. He patted Jem gently on the shoulder and whispered words of comfort. "We did our best," he said softly. "That's all any of us can do." The courtroom seemed to murmur with disbelief, anger, and relief, depending on who you asked. Scout noticed the deep sadness on Tom Robinson's face, the quiet resignation that had settled over him. Jem couldn't speak. He sat frozen, trying to understand how fairness could be so easily ignored. As the town slowly emptied, Scout stayed close to Atticus, her thoughts heavy. She realized that even though the jury had made the wrong decision, her father had shown her what courage truly meant. He had fought for justice, even knowing the odds were against him. That evening, Scout and Jem walked home in the fading light. The air felt heavy and still, filled with the quiet understanding of injustice. But Scout also felt something else, a flicker of hope, a warmth from knowing that courage, truth, and kindness could exist, even in a world that was not always fair. That night, Scout lay in bed thinking about the people she'd seen that day, the good, the flawed, the brave, and the fearful. And though the world seemed darker, she felt a quiet strength within herself, Jem and her father, a strength that would carry them forward no matter what lay ahead.
The day after the trial, Maycomb felt different. The town moved quietly, as if holding its breath. Scout and Jim walked to school together, noticing whispers and sideways glances. Jim felt heavier, older somehow, and Scout sensed a new weight on his shoulders. At home, Atticus tried to comfort them. He spoke softly about the trial, about fairness and justice, and about the courage it took to stand up for what was right. He reminded them that not all battles are won, and that sometimes the bravest thing is simply to try. That afternoon, a small gesture reminded them of the kindness that still existed in Maycomb. A group of townspeople had come to show support for Atticus. A few brought food, some spoke quietly of respect for what he had done. Scout noticed that even in a world filled with prejudice and fear, there were still people who believed in goodness. Jim sat quietly in the living room, thinking about Tom Robinson, about the jury, and about the cruelty and courage he had seen. He began to understand that life was more complicated than he had imagined, that people were capable of both great kindness and deep unfairness. Scout, meanwhile, felt a new sense of awareness. She thought about her father's calm strength, about Boo Radley's silent gifts, and about the lessons hidden in the quiet moments of life. Courage wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, patient, and steady, like her father's voice. That night, as Scout lay in bed, she thought about how the world could be harsh and unjust, but also about the small acts of goodness that made life bearable. She understood that even though the trial had ended badly, the lessons she and Jim had learned were treasures of their own. Lessons about fairness, empathy, and bravery that would stay with them forever.
The days after the trial moved slowly. The heat pressed down on Maycomb, heavy and still, and a quiet sadness seemed to linger in the Finch house. Jem spent most of his time thinking, his face serious, his eyes distant. Scout could tell that something in him had changed. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was beginning to see the world with grown-up eyes. One evening, Jem sat with Atticus on the porch. The night air was soft, and the sounds of crickets filled the silence between their words. Jem asked the question that had been troubling him since the verdict. "Atticus," he said, "how could they do it? How could the jury say Tom was guilty when everyone knew he wasn't?" Atticus looked at his son carefully before answering. His voice was calm, gentle. "It's not easy to explain, Jem," he said. "But people are afraid of change. They hold on to old ways of thinking, even when they know it's wrong. It takes time and courage to do what's right." Jem's hands clenched. "It's not fair," he said quietly. "No," Atticus agreed, "it's not. But remember, we can't lose hope. Every step forward, no matter how small, still matters." Scout listened from the porch swing, her legs dangling. She didn't understand everything, but she could feel the sadness in her father's voice. She realized that courage wasn't just about fighting. Sometimes it was about staying gentle in a world that wanted to make you hard. That night, Jem sat awake for a long time, thinking about the trial, about the jury, and about his father's quiet strength. Scout, too, lay in her bed, wondering if people could ever truly change. The house was quiet, except for the soft rustle of the wind outside. Even in the darkness, Scout felt a strange warmth. The comfort of knowing her father would never stop believing in what was right. And though Maycomb was full of injustice, there was also love, patience,
and hope. Small lights in the dark that refused to go out.
The hot afternoon sunlight poured through the curtains of the Finch house. Inside, Aunt Alexandra had gathered the ladies of Maycomb for her missionary tea. The air smelled of cake, coffee, and perfume. Scout wore a little dress and sat quietly beside her aunt, trying her best to behave like a proper young lady, though her mind often drifted elsewhere. The women spoke politely at first, laughing softly and sipping their tea. But as Scout listened, she began to notice something beneath their smiles, a kind of coldness that hid behind their kind words. They talked about charity and helping the poor, yet their voices turned sharp when they mentioned certain people in town. Miss Maudie said calmly through it all, when one of the ladies made a cruel remark about Atticus defending Tom Robinson, Miss Maudie's eyes flashed for just a moment. Her tone stayed gentle, but her words carried quiet power. She reminded them that real goodness didn't need to be spoken about. It was shown through action. Scout admired her deeply. As the tea went on, Scout watched the women carefully. She realized that being a lady wasn't just about wearing nice clothes or having good manners. It was about strength, the kind of quiet, steady strength her aunt showed when she held her head high and Miss Maudie showed when she spoke truth with calm grace. Then, as the afternoon faded, Atticus came home earlier than expected. His face was pale, his shoulders heavy. He whispered something to Aunt Alexandra, and the laughter in the room faded into silence. Scout watched as her aunt's eyes filled with tears. Miss Maudie placed a hand gently on her arm. The news was heartbreaking. Tom Robinson had been killed while trying to escape from prison. He had run, and the guards had shot him. The room stayed quiet. Scout didn't fully understand why he would try to run, but she felt the weight of the sadness in the air. Aunt Alexandria composed herself, straightened her dress, and returned to her guests with quiet dignity. Miss Maudie followed, her expression calm but full of strength. Scout then realized that courage came in many forms, in her father's honesty, in Tom's quiet dignity, and in the way her aunt and Miss Maudie faced heartbreak without losing their grace. That evening, as Scout changed out of her dress, she looked out the window at the soft evening sky. The world still seemed unfair, but she felt a little older, a little wiser. She was beginning to see how real strength lived quietly, hidden beneath gentleness and calm.
The night was quiet and cool when Scout finally stood on Boo Radley's porch. Everything around her, the street lights, the trees, the faint hum of crickets, felt softer now, almost peaceful. The chaos of the night was over. Moments earlier, her brother Jem had been attacked on their way home from the school play. Scout, dressed in her funny ham costume, had been frightened and confused. But in the darkness, someone had saved them. Someone quiet and pale, who had carried Jem safely back to the house. It was Boo Radley. For years, Boo had been the town's mystery, the man behind the shutters, the figure in children's stories, the one they feared and imagined. But standing there now, Scout finally saw the truth. Boo wasn't a monster. He was kind, gentle, and painfully shy. He had been watching over them all along, protecting them from the shadows. When Atticus thanked Boo and told him goodbye, Scout led him to the porch. Boo smiled faintly, then stepped back into his house, closing the door softly behind him. Scout stood there for a moment, looking out over the neighborhood from Boo's porch, and suddenly everything looked different. She saw her street, the Finch house, Miss Maudie's garden, the trees where they had played, but now she saw it all through Boo's eyes. She imagined the children running, laughing, growing up under his quiet watch.
He had seen their lives unfold from behind those windows, caring silently in his own gentle way. Scout thought of something Atticus had told her long ago. You never really understand a person until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. Standing there, she finally understood what he meant. She realized that goodness often hides quietly, in kindness that expects nothing in return, in the people who protect others without needing to be seen. As she walked back home, Atticus was sitting beside Jem, who was sleeping peacefully. He looked tired, but calm. Scout climbed into his lap, and he read to her softly from one of her storybooks, until her eyes grew heavy. When he carried her to bed, she whispered, "He was real nice." Atticus smiled gently. "Most people are, Scout," he said, "when you finally see them." Scout drifted off to sleep, feeling safe, warm, and full of understanding. The night outside was still, the stars watching quietly over Maycomb. And in that small, sleepy town, Scout Finch had finally learned what it meant to see the world with both courage and compassion.